Thank you all for joining me today. So you know a little bit about myself and in our topic. Obviously, we're talking about potty training. This is part of our Ask a BCBA series. So you know a little bit about me. I'm James Macon. I'm a board certified behavior analyst. I've worked in the field of behavior analysis for the past 20 years. Typically in either clinics, working with kids with autism, hospitals, residential facilities, but also with neurotypical kids and adults as well. And as a behavior analyst, we use a science called behavior analysis. And the idea is we can use this natural science to help improve socially significant behavior. And of course, one of the most socially significant that everyone will have to experience is learning how to use a toilet, or also known as potty training. So I will make an assumption off the bat here that while these principles apply to everyone, I'm going to use kind of autism as a theme kind of throughout this. But just please keep in mind, these principles apply to neurotypical kids and neurotypical adults as well. And my hope is at the end of this presentation that there's a few takeaways. Of course, we want this to be actionable and relevant. And a few things you should be able to walk away with is one, identify why potty training can be scary for some kids. Two, describe what parts of this behavioral contingency that you can adjust to change behavior. And then three, describe how potty training in a day works. And we'll go through these specifically, but there is kind of this procedure for, hey, how do we get this potty training done within a day? So for those of you on the call, these may be challenges you experience today in real time. And if not, maybe you experienced them before. Maybe they're concerns that you're thinking about. But the reason why we would consider potty training to be socially significant is because there are real implications when we go to use it. And from the child's perspective, when we introduce the toilet, we've just changed the rules on them. They're used to doing it a certain way, and now we've introduced this kind of foreign, strange object, and it's scary. And wait a minute, why can't I just keep using the pull-up like I've always done? And often what happens is this leads to an emotional reaction. And you can see in our picture here, our kid does not look very, very happy. He's having a tantrum. Perhaps some of you have experienced or gone through this before. The other component here is when we're talking about young kids and they're going to school, schools will often require kids to be potty trained. Some schools will say, okay, well, we'll help them, we'll help facilitate. But a lot of other schools say, nope, you have to be potty trained before you can enroll or before admission. And of course, if you do have someone who's going through potty training, there can be accidents. And accidents can be messy, and it can be very labor intensive as well. One of the questions is, well, when should I switch from pull-ups to underwear? And if we are underwear and there are accidents, obviously this can be very, very labor intensive. And ultimately, what I think is the most important variable here is if we don't learn to use the toilet, we'll basically have this restricted access to the community. And that's kind of, behavioral talk. We phrase things in a funny way, but if I don't know how to use the toilet, how am I going to go to a restaurant? How am I going to go to a movie? How am I going to go to school? All of these things that you and I, sometimes we take for granted. If we don't know how to use a toilet, we can't go out into the public and we can't enjoy these things that the rest of society does. I mentioned kind of this change of rules, and I really want to emphasize this. For kids, whenever they need to eliminate waste, they need to go potty, the rule has always been that I use a diaper or I use a pull-up. from the time that they can remember and from before then. It's always, I use the diaper, I use the pillow. And when we introduce this toilet, that thing is scary. It's strange. I could fall in. It's a lot more effort. All of these things can lead to that emotional response that we saw in the last frame, in the last picture. And when we introduce rules, whether it's about potty training or about anything else, anytime we change the rules, we can expect some kind of resistance, or at least we should not be surprised if there's some resistance and a corresponding emotional reaction. So our goal is, well, how do we minimize the disruption and increase our chance for success if we are going to change the rules? And just a primer on that. So we'll talk very briefly about applied behavior analysis, or ABA, and kind of how it relates to this. So the first thing I would mention is behavior analysis is a natural science, just like biology, just like chemistry, just like physics. And I think biology kind of has a good model. So if we looked at the body, well, the body is made up of these smaller organs. And these organs are made up of these smaller parts that are cells, which are made up of molecules. And finally, we get to the atom, which is the smallest unit of measurement. And in the same way, we can look at behavior. We can look at a personality trait or a personality characteristic or a pattern of responding. And those are made up of these behavioral habits. And behavioral habits are made up of these individual behavioral contingencies that, when presented enough times, they become stronger. And the more we're exposed to those contingencies, well, pretty soon they do become habits. And pretty soon those habits become part of us. So, but it all starts with this really small unit of the behavioral contingency. And perhaps another analogy here is, if we look at these two images here, we have a forest, and now we have a path. And just like a trail like this, the more we use behavior, the easier it becomes. In fact, I would add, the more we use behavior, the stronger it becomes. And that's why using those behavioral contingencies, the more we're presented with them, the more we respond a certain way, the stronger and more durable that behavior becomes. So we talked about this behavioral contingency being the smallest part of behavior. And what does that exactly look like? This is our behavioral contingency. And we call this a 3-term contingency. It's the smallest unit of measurement in behavioral science. And the example I've put up here is if we have to use the restroom, we have to eliminate waste. And in this example, we have this antecedent or before condition. And if you think about it, if I have to go to the bathroom, I feel this pressure, and the behavior is, well, I go to the bathroom and I eliminate this waste. And as a consequence, after that, I don't feel pressure. So the key is we can look at from the before to the after, and we go from pressure to no pressure. So we have relief. The thing with these 3-term or 4-term contingencies, which I'll talk about in a moment, the basic underlying concept here is that the effects of our actions determine whether or not we're going to repeat them. In this example, well, we felt relief. We had pressure, now we don't have pressure. So we're much more likely to repeat this in the future. If we wanted to analyze this one layer up, we would look at the 4-term contingency. And all that means is now we're looking at motivation. And in this example, the motivating operation is, well, how much fluid have I consumed? If I've had a lot of fluid, it's going to make the motivation and this pressure much greater. So I'm going to be much more motivated to engage in this behavior to eliminate than if I had drinking a little bit of fluid. And that will become more of an important concept as we move forward. I'll show you guys, but this is kind of that basic building block. If we were to kind of focus on some of these individual parts, so on the antecedent side, the natural stimuli, so the pressure, it should trigger that response, that behavior of wanting to eliminate. And as a note, for some kids, this can take some time for them to identify this sensation. For very early learners, they may not be aware of this sensation, and they may not have bladder control yet. As they get older and they learn that sensation and they learn how to control that bladder, that's usually when we want to start teaching potty training. But all of this stuff on the antecedent side, this is how we can trigger behavior before it happens. On the consequence side, consequences are what maintain the behavior. In most typical conversation, if we talk about a consequence, it typically has this negative connotation. We don't mean it in a negative way. We mean it as whatever comes after the behavior. But a natural consequence of feeling relief, of no longer having pressure, that's a natural reinforcer, and it should maintain this response of eliminating waste or of going to the bathroom. And from a technical perspective, we would call this negative reinforcement. It's negative only because we've removed something. We had pressure, now we don't have pressure. So we've removed a stimulus, so it's negative, and it's reinforcement because we expect this behavior to continue in the future. But the end result here is that the individual or child feels relief, and they've escaped from this sensation of pressure. Now, the challenge when we talk about potty training is seldom are there just one of these contingencies. Usually there are multiple, and usually they compete against each other. The first one we've talked through. There's this pressure, I go to the bathroom, I eliminate, and now there's no pressure. So I feel relief, I feel better, and that's this negative reinforcement contingency. This is good, this is natural, this is what we expect to see. From the child's perspective, however, if we introduce a toilet and they're afraid of the toilet, and now there's all this effort involved, now we have a different contingency. And if we were to diagram it out like we did here, well, we've got no effort and no fear. And now I'm being asked to go sit on the toilet. I'm trying to eliminate on it. And now there is effort and there is fear because this toilet is scary. It's unusual. I don't want to fall in, and I have to work really hard at it. So because we've added something, we would call this positive punishment. And these labels don't matter as much. You guys don't have to remember this, but I want you to kind of see the mechanics behind it. In this example, there was no fear, no effort, and now there is fear and effort. So we've added this positive punishment contingency, and from the child's perspective, they're not very happy about it. And if we were to look at this a slightly different way and ask ourselves, well, which contingency is more favorable? If I were the child, which one would I want to do? We have our motivating operation. We've consumed a given amount of liquid, and we have to use the restroom. And on the top here, well, there's pressure. And if I use the old trusty pull-up and I just go on the pull-up like I've always done, because those are the rules, now I feel relief. There's no longer any pressure. And you can see here, even the way pull-ups are advertised, well, even if he goes, he's 99% dry, he's comfortable, he feels relief. That is a happy, happy boy. And on the bottom, oh, now we've asked him to use the toilet, and we've introduced potty training. And before, they still have pressure, but now they didn't have any fear and they didn't have to do any work. But now I've asked them to go in the toilet, and now they have to do work. Now there's effort, and now there's fear. And you can tell this child is not happy. So what do we do with this information? How do we take it and actually implement potty training, implement something that's going to be successful for our kids? And just to kind of summarize, We've discussed using a pull-up is comfortable, it's familiar. Those are the rules that we have always used. And using a toilet, it can be scary and it can be effortful. And from our perspective, if we want to address this, we need to rearrange those antecedents and consequences. And when we do so, we're actually using that ABA or applied behavior analysis approach. And I won't talk through this bottom image, but just so you guys can kind of see, anytime we're talking about increasing behavior, we're talking about reinforcement, and either we're adding or removing a stimulus. And if we expect behavior to decrease, we're talking about punishment. And we don't mean punishment the same way that society would use the term. When we say punishment, we only are observing that this behavior is decreasing, that we expect it to happen less in the future. So without further ado, using ABA to potty train kind of looks like this. We're going to modify these behavioral contingencies, and we're going to do so both on the antecedent side and the consequence side. So I'll talk through some of these at a high level, and then we'll get into some specifics. But you can see on the antecedent side, and if you remember, those are things that can help trigger behavior. They happen before the actual behavior. And these can include switching to underwear, modifying the toilet or some of the properties around the toilet, such as putting food dye or using a target, adding some preferred music or other preferred stimuli to the bathroom. So it becomes a more enjoyable place to go to. Having social stories. We're actually trying to introduce a new rule that can compete with the old one about the pull-up and about the diaper. And then, of course, if we're drinking lots of fluids, it gives us more practice opportunities. Our motivating operation or how likely it is that we're going to want to go to the bathroom is changed if we drink a lot of fluids. So if we have a good day to practice, we drink a lot of fluids, we're going to get lots of practice opportunities. And some other strategies, of course, if we're using loose clothing, that helps us as parents and caregivers to help prompt that behavior. And using a model, and I'll show you guys specifically kind of what that looks like. On the consequence side, it looks a little bit different, and these are stimuli that maintain behavior. They don't trigger it, but they maintain it. And here we can use a task analysis. That's basically where we take this complex behavior and we break it down into much smaller, much more manageable steps. And as always, we prompt if necessary because we want the child to get a correct response. And then using differential reinforcement when we're dry, and high magnitude reinforcement if we actually are successful in using the bathroom. And then the last thing, having some exclusive reinforcers that are only available in the bathroom or when we actually use the toilet. So these are some high level, and now let's talk about some specifics. So switching to underwear. From the child's perspective, which is going to be more favorable here? Well, if we've had a given amount of fluids, and if I go in my pull-up here, well, beforehand there was no wet feeling. There's no aversive experience of being wet. If I go in the pull-up, well, guess what? I still feel exactly the same. There is no wet feeling. There is no aversive feeling because these are designed to be very, very absorbent. And when we start potty training, one of those things, remember, first we said we have to identify, can a child identify that sensation? Are they starting to have control of it? And when we do reach that point, now we can switch to underwear. And now we kind of add this new rule or new contingency. I don't have a wet feeling. If I eliminate in the underwear, now there's this wet feeling and it feels aversive, it feels uncomfortable. And this is a natural contingency. Now, we don't want to be wet, but if we experience that, then we learn, hey, that's something that I should try to avoid in the future because it doesn't feel good. Now, this strategy in isolation would not result in successful potty training. but it's one of those antecedents that we can change that's going to increase the probability of success. And what you'll see here on this list is there's 9 items listed here. And generally, we're trying to modify or rearrange as many of these as possible to make that probability more likely that we're going to be successful. So what are some other strategies? Modifying the toilet. So if there is this fear of the toilet, I'm scared of it, I don't want to fall in, this is uncomfortable, it's strange, I want nothing to do with it. Well, we can modify it so it is more comfortable and that it is less aversive. So what does that look like? On the bottom are some examples: a modified child seat, another modified child seat where there's a ladder, so it's a little bit easier to get up on, and I'm much less likely to fall off the toilet. And should someone either fall in or fall off the toilet during those early stages, it dramatically increases the challenge in potty training. Another thing we can do is modifying the stimulus properties of the toilet. So that can look like here they've added a target. So this is to help teach a young boy how to aim. Other times people have used Cheerios, or they've used plastic rings. Sometimes they'll put food dye in the toilet. And when it goes from blue, and if we add this yellow urine, now it becomes green. And that can be very reinforcing to watch if you're a young child or if you're a young child with autism. So we're just trying to rearrange these stimulus properties so it becomes more fun, less scary, and more engaging for the individual. I mentioned social stories before. In most cases, we have to experience some consequence. And as a result of experiencing that consequence, we form a rule. And the one we talked about earlier is, well, if I've always gone to the toilet or I've gone potty in my pull-up and I feel this pressure, I eliminate waste, and now I don't feel pressure. And there was no effort involved. That forms that rule we talked about where, okay, if I have to eliminate waste, I just go in the pull-up. And because I've experienced that consequence, now I can tell myself this rule, whether I'm aware of it or not. There's this new rule governed behavior. For social stories, what we're trying to do is kind of superimplant or superimpose this new rule on top of it. And some kids will respond very well to social stories. Other kids won't, and it depends on can they attend to the story. But in this example, we walk through, hey, everyone goes to the bathroom. It can be scary, but we get these really cool rewards and everyone's really, really happy when we go. And obviously there is more content to it than this, but just as an example, this can be a really effective way to kind of shortcut and not have to experience a lot of other consequences to get to the target behavior of using the toilet. Some other strategies, especially if you're in early stages, have to do with using timers. So we can build a schedule, we can follow this routine, we can start the timer and the timer goes off, and both the parent or caregiver as well as the child learn, okay, when the timer goes off, I go to the potty, I go to the toilet. And early on, we generally start with something as frequently as every 15 minutes. And then if we start having success, now we can fade it back. I mean, go every 30 minutes, every hour. But the idea is during this early stage, the child is still developing kind of control over those sensory reinforcers and stimulation of knowing, okay, I feel that pressure, I know I need to go to the bathroom now. Closely related to the use of timers is having more fluids. And I'll preface that when we use more fluids, we want to do this either when we have a dedicated caregiver who can facilitate this, or for us, if we're home and we have more time, or it's the weekend and we know that we can dedicate a certain number of hours to this procedure. But we have a lot of preferred fluids because we want the child their bladder to be really, really full. And we also want to have kind of loose clothing on. And because we've consumed all these fluids, that motivating operation is there. We're much more likely to feel the pressure and therefore much more likely to need to eliminate that waste. So as soon as we kind of see that potty dance where, okay, I can tell that it appears that they need to go to the bathroom, boom, we prompt them, or we walk or escort them to the bathroom. We help prompt them if necessary to sit on the toilet or to stand, and to eliminate from there. And then we can apply these reinforcement strategies of praise and reward. But because we've consumed all these fluids, we have lots of opportunities to practice. And with any behavior, kind of like the picture of the forest and in the trail, the more we practice, the more opportunities there are, the stronger that behavior will become. So we definitely need those practice opportunities. Some other antecedent strategies, so we can add other preferred items to the routine. This can include adding music. If there are certain YouTube videos that are highly preferred, we can add those to the toilet, we can add those within the bathroom, and they become these stimuli that make going to the bathroom much more fun. But what about the other strategy? We talked about antecedents. They trigger behavior. They make that behavior more likely to occur, but they don't actually maintain the behavior. We need a consequence to maintain the behavior. And one of the first strategies here is using a task analysis. And I'll show you what that looks like on the next slide, but it basically takes this very complex behavior and breaks it into smaller and smaller components that are much more manageable, much more easier to measure and to shape. And we evaluate where within this task analysis do things break down. A lot of times a kid will be able to do most of the steps of going potty, but there might be one or two areas where they struggle or have some challenges. The other strategy, we talked about adding reinforcers to the bathroom. An additional layer above that is adding exclusive reinforcers. So we have some very special, highly preferred reinforcer, but it's only available during potty or during the bathroom. Sometimes we'll make it so that exclusive reinforcer is only available if they use the bathroom and if they successfully use the toilet. Both of those strategies are successful, although they have slightly different results. If going to the bathroom is very, very aversive, well, then we can have these exclusive reinforcers in the bathroom. If going to the bathroom isn't the problem, but using the toilet is, well, now we can make it so, hey, if you use the toilet, you get this really, really cool, very exclusive reinforcer. Now, to look at the task analysis, and I can provide copies of this if you guys would like, but the idea is that a caregiver or a behavior analyst would use this to help shape using the bathroom. And it kind of looks like, well, what does the typical person do or typical child do if they have to go to the bathroom? And let's break down all the steps that are involved in that process. The first thing that we typically want to see is, well, can they say, hey, I need to go to the bathroom? And then do they physically walk to the bathroom? Are they able to pull down their pants and underwear? Can they sit on the toilet? When they're done, do they flush? And are they able to pull their pants and underwear up? And of course, we can't stop there. Next, we need to wash our hands. So we turn on the sink. We apply soap to our hands and we rub them. We rinse our hands. We turn off the water. And finally, we dry them. And all of these steps are kind of socially what we would expect to see from someone using a toilet and going to the bathroom successfully. And the way this instrument becomes a tool is we can record a binary. Either they can do this step independently with the plus, or they are not able to do this step independently with the minus. And as we go through this, if there's a minus or they aren't able to do it, well, now we can apply some level of support. So let's assume that they can say, I need to go to the bathroom. they're able to walk to the bathroom and pull their pants and underwear down. But when it comes time to sit on the toilet, they have a difficult time. Well, we can use, here I have it notated as FP, but this is a full physical prompt. You can see a key here on the right-hand side. And the idea is I'm providing the most assistance as possible using this full physical prompt. As they become more competent on getting on the toilet, well, now I can provide a partial physical prompt. So I'm not quite doing the most intrusive. I've kind of removed myself a little bit. I'm not letting the child doing it more independently. And then lastly, maybe I fade out this partial physical, and now I'm just pointing. Now I'm just gesturing to the individual to finish that step. And where might that be more applicable? Okay, well, if we can get through these first 7 steps, but then when it comes time to turn on the sink or to wash our hands, maybe it requires some hand over hand prompting, which would be a physical prompt. And as they get better, now we can kind of fade ourselves out. We can fade out that level of prompt and assistance. Now we're only using a partial physical. And then eventually we're just pointing to the sink, we're pointing to the soap, and the individual is able to do it much, much more independently. Probably the most famous toilet training program was developed by 2 behavior analysts, Nathan Azrin and Richard Fox. And this book came out, I think, in 1989. And the simple version, and I have some data sheets too. If any of you guys want it, you're welcome to have it. I'm happy to share. But it involved kind of this potty party. And the idea is we have all of these highly preferred beverages, highly preferred juices, and we're consuming them. And in kind of conceptually, think about, hey, it's a Saturday morning. I've got this like 4 or 5 hour chunk of time, or maybe they're in ABA therapy and maybe this is the procedure that they're using. But in either case, we have this dedicated chunk of time, and we're drinking lots of fluids, and we're also using this doll. The doll is also drinking fluid, and this doll actually will urinate. So if it consumes fluid, some of the fluid will come out. So that the idea is, as we're consuming fluids, we're also giving the doll some fluid. And then we're prompting the doll through all of the steps we have here of going to the bathroom. And that doll acts as a model prompt for what we expect of the child. And in the same way that we used a social story to help create these new rules, here we're using a doll to create these new rules. So once we've started this process, we're using the model prompt with the doll, we're drinking all these fluids. Pretty soon we start doing these spot checks. Every 3 minutes, we're taking the child's hand and we're checking, are we dry? And if we're dry, we're providing reinforcement, usually in the form of some verbal praise. We could even use some small edible reinforcers if necessary. The idea is we want the child to feel like, wow, you're still dry. That's awesome. Like, keep up the good work. If they're wet, we're not punishing or saying anything aversive, but we're providing some corrective statements like, oh, when we need to go to the potty, we go to the bathroom. We do it like the doll did. So we're going to go to the bathroom. And then every 15 minutes, we're actually going to sit on the toilet. And because we've consumed all of these fluids, the likelihood of even accidentally of eliminating some of this waste of urinating is much, much greater. And when the child does eliminate on the toilet, we provide this high magnitude reinforcer. It's like night and day, like a light switch going on and off. We want the environment to clearly change for them to experience like, wow, I've done something really, really good. Mom and dad are really, really happy right now. I definitely want to do this again in the future. And lastly, because again, we've had all these fluids, we're going to get lots of opportunities to practice this in the future during the rest of that session or rest of that day. So this is what one of those data sheets could look like. This is actually a little bit more advanced than that initial 15-minute criteria. This assumes that, okay, we've gone through the 15-minute criteria. Now we're doing every 30 minutes. But again, we're recording that we've gone through all of these steps. We're recording whether or not we're dry, whether or not we're wet, and we're using this as an instrument to evaluate progress. Are we making progress as we go through this potty training procedure? So some things to watch out for. Whenever we start potty training, because we're changing the rules, there is a high probability that we might see some emotional behavior or some tantrum behavior. And I've described two contingencies here. The first is from the child. The second is from the parent or caregiver. And from the child's perspective, if they have to sit on the toilet, but they don't want to, because again, this is aversive, we've changed the rules, they want nothing to do with this thing. And if they have a tantrum, there's a chance that, hey, maybe mom and dad will let me off this. They see that I'm upset. And if they do, I won't have to sit on this toilet. From the child's perspective, this is a negative reinforcement contingency because we're removing this having to sit down on the toilet, which is aversive to them. And the tantrum worked. They were able to get off of the toilet. So they're much more likely to try this behavior again in the future. And from the parent's perspective, that tantrum, it becomes its own trigger or own antecedent. And if you're a parent and you're hearing your child tantrum and have this just emotional reaction while they're on the toilet, I mean, it sounds terrible. No one wants to hear that. And the natural response is, okay, I'm going to let you get off the toilet. And as a result, the tantrum stops. So apparently this is kind of this win-win situation. The child didn't want to sit in the toilet. They had a tantrum. And as a result, they got to leave. Negative reinforcement. From the parent's perspective, there was this tantrum and they allowed them to escape or to get off, and the tantrum stopped. This seems like a win-win. The problem is, because from the child's perspective, this is a reinforcement contingency. And because we've just unintentionally reinforced tantrum behavior, tantrums are much more likely to occur in the future. And it kind of creates this faulty feedback loop that we're seeing on the bottom here. And it kind of looks like, okay, if I'm the child, I'm tantruming. So because I'm tantruming, I'm allowed to escape. And as a result, the tantrum stops from the parents. It's a win-win. But eventually, I'm going to have to sit on the toilet again. But what I've experienced, if I sit on the toilet and if I tantrum, I'm allowed to escape. And the tantrum stops. And you can see that this goes on. And it becomes this very difficult thing to change if we unintentionally reinforce this. And ultimately, anytime we have any sort of challenging behavior, it's a form of communication. And what the child is really saying here is like, hey, this is scary. I don't want to sit here. And there's nothing wrong with that. The only thing wrong here is that tantrums aren't necessarily the most effective way to communicate that. So instead of unintentionally reinforcing tantrums, we would want to do something like this. So we want to use differential reinforcement and reinforce a more appropriate response. On the top here, this looks almost the same as the last slide. So I'm going to have to sit in the toilet. If I tantrum, I won't have to sit in the toilet. That is a win for this child if he's scared. From the parent's perspective, what's a more appropriate response? Well, here I will have to sit in the toilet. If I say all done, now I can leave. Now I don't have to sit on the toilet. Functionally, these two contingencies are identical. They lead to the same consequence and they have the same trigger or same antecedent. The only thing that's different is we've replaced the behavior. So this is a much more effective strategy. And conceptually, saying all done is easier than screaming, crying, throwing to the floor, or otherwise expending the energy necessary for a tantrum. And then anytime we're talking about using differential reinforcement or having a replacement or alternative behavior, the emphasis is on one, it has to have the same consequence, and two, it should be easier. It should be a lot easier and more efficient for the child to say all done than to have the tantrum. Now, some other considerations on this. I've used the label all done as an example. But really, this should be customized to the environment and to the individual. And if the individual does not have a lot of vocal behavior, well, then we can use an approximation. It can be a gesture, it can be a sign, maybe it's just one word. But again, it produces the same outcome as the tantrum behavior. It might be a different label. Maybe we say, can I wait a minute? Or can we do it later? All of those are appropriate so long as they're more efficient than this tantrum behavior. The other important thing to mention is this behavioral concept called extinction. And I'm sure everyone on this call has experienced this before, but the idea is if I have this rule, and this rule has been reinforced in the past. So the example we've used during this call is, okay, the rule is if I feel pressure, if I have to go to the bathroom, now I use the diaper, I use the pull-up. That's what I've always done. That's the reinforcement contingency. If I change the rule, if I stop the reinforcement contingency for something that has been previously reinforced or has a history of reinforcement, we're going to experience this extinction burst. And what that looks like, sometimes we have a honeymoon period, sometimes we don't. But the extinction is we see this huge burst of behavior, and usually in this context, it could be crying, it could be tantrums, it could be an increase in both frequency and duration of tantrums, and it can include trying things novel ways. And eventually, if we're consistent, it goes down to 0 or near 0 levels. And then we usually have these things called extinction or spontaneous recovery, where we get a first spike, a second spike. And so long as we're consistent, they go back down. And to kind of put this in context, the example I usually give is, well, if you call your parent or your friend every day at the same time, 5 o'clock, every day for years. 5 o'clock, okay, yep, I'm going to call my friend, I'm going to call my parent, and that's what we do. And if one day you call and they don't answer, and that would be highly unusual. Now we've just changed the rules. What would happen? Well, you'd probably call them again. So now we have this extinction burst. You might even try texting them. If they still don't answer, maybe you leave a voicemail, and eventually like, okay, well, I'm going to stop calling. They must be busy. And a few hours pass, like, okay, I'm worried. Let me try to call them. Let me try to text them again. And you get another spike. And eventually, hey, maybe I'm just going to drive over there. But the point is, because this response has always been reinforced the same way in the past, if it no longer is reinforced, we're going to go through this extinction process. And extinction looks the same, regardless of whether you're talking about a child or an adult, someone with autism or neurotypical, and it doesn't matter the behavior. It is consistently going to look like this. And what we have to be very careful of, going back to our last example, if we're expecting an extinction burst like this, we don't want to reinforce the tantrum. We want to have this replacement behavior that we can use instead, so we can circumvent this. We can avoid it. So I'm happy to answer any questions. My email and phone number are up on the slides. Some other things I'll just kind of briefly talk about. Most of this presentation, we were talking about potty training in the context of having to urinate. But we would use the same strategy, the same approach, if we were talking about having a BM or bowel movement. And the emphasis would be on what can we rearrange on the antecedent side, and what can we rearrange on the consequence side to make this behavior more likely to occur. And Like with any behavior, if it's not occurring, well, can we prompt it? Can we help facilitate it? So from your guys' perspective, if there are any questions, if you have more challenges around BMs instead of urination, if there's a different topic or different area that would be helpful to talk about, I'm happy to go through those. And hopefully, if we think back to those initial questions or objectives, hopefully we've answered some of those for you guys. But the idea is if we want to address some of these behaviors that we initially talked about, why potty training is scary? Well, it's something new. It involves effort and involves a change the rules. Because of that, kids aren't happy. And in terms of what parts of a behavioral contingency can we adjust? Well, we can change things on the antecedent side, and we can change things on the consequence side. And from a potty training in a day perspective, at least with urination, it involves kind of having that party, having lots of preferred fluids, wearing loose clothing, and then doing very, very frequent spot checks and rushing to the bathroom when we think the behavior is about to occur.